Good morning, everyone. It's good to be back. I was here last week, shared with you part one of how to stay connected with children and their families during stressful times. And we talked about the social emotional needs that we are starting to understand more when it comes to who we are, because we have definitely moved and evolved in our understanding of neurodiversity, which is just a fancy name of saying how our brains are different. But we know that the differences in who we are and how we think and how we feel affect how we relate to each other. And because the body, the church, is relational, I thought that this topic would be relevant and have some impact on how we treat each other, how we think about each other, and how we care for one another. I'm not going to revisit last week,
But it is on the site.
It's going to be on the site. It's going to be on the site. But I did want to just recap quickly. We talked last week about the social emotional needs. We didn't get into protective factors, so we're going to do a quick walkthrough with that today. And then if all goes well, we're going to just talk about mindfulness and reflection, some coping skills, how to help with anxiety. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to self-care. Is really what I think is critical when we think about how we can care for families. So I'm going to go through these slides that we covered last week. Okay, so protective factors, I wanted to bring this up quickly because it is a framework, it is a mindset that many institutions, agencies, governing bodies think about when they want language that encompasses relationships and social emotional needs and how people can maybe be touched or cared for in a more impactful or effective way. And the common sense notion, I guess, is that it comes from a thinking that we assume. Often we assume that people will speak up. Often we assume that someone will know what they need, but what we're coming to realize is a lot of people don't necessarily know what they need. And so whenever there's an institution that welcomes people, to already have the framework in mind that we can offer people their needs without them necessarily having to ask. It's a very inviting, welcoming way to say that you matter to us, we see you, we care about you. And that's where I go back to saying, I think that this is what Scripture and the gospel is all about. How do we welcome people into the fold? I also like to use the protective factors because it does help, the research behind it does acknowledge that it mitigates stressful factors, which is the premise of this talk, is how can we help meet the needs for people when they're in stress? And the whole research behind this was assuming that we all are stressed out, or assuming that we all are affected by stress. So what can the church do? What can people do to help mitigate the impact on families because we are enduring so much stress? There's 6 protective factors. Oops, moved ahead there. 6 of them, and I use the original language, but then I guess you could say I modernized the language and I used it into more of what would say like receivable language. And so I offer this to the church, to ministries, to think about when they're encompassing or wanting to develop policies or procedures, that maybe there's some words here that can be considered when wanting to invite, open, welcome people and expand where thinking has been and where opportunities of ministry can go. We want to be able to enhance caregiver resilience. Now, resilience is kind of a buzzword lately. It's basically saying that when we're stretched, we're not going to break. When we're stretched, we're going to be able to come back to our original form. And yes, we've somewhat changed, but we still are somewhat of the same structure. And resilience, from what we know, is as where our research and studies are going and trying to appreciate who we are. Because some people want to protect people from pain. Like I used the example last week we talked about, like every child on the team will get a medal, or everybody's going to be given accolades, when not everybody wins. And it's okay to hurt. It's okay to bump your knee. It's okay to have a headache. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to be mad. To protect people or buffer people from those things does not teach them much, because part of life is knowing how to handle those things, and that expands our capacity to be able to live in a world that sometimes is going to hurt us and it's going to affect us in a negative way. So resilience is understanding that we do need to expose our children, ourselves included, in what it's like to sometimes not always have what we want or get what we need. We want to be able to develop more social connections, which I think is beautifully done here at this church. I also have noticed already you have a beautiful coffee shop that you come into when you walk in the frame from the parking lot. The signage on this bottom, or on the, I guess it's like the lining of the archway, says welcome. I mean, there's so many things that you're already trying to connect with people as they walk onto campus. We know that building knowledge of caregiving and child development, which is one of the reasons that I'm here, is also part of the protective factors to be able to offer concrete support in times of need. Many churches have food pantries. They may have, basic needs for people such as gas cards or money that they can be given, and if they need a place to stay, or blankets. I know a lot of churches they have like a sewing ministry, that kind of thing, where they give families when they're having newborns in the hospital. So that's something that I think the church has always been really good at. Now, fostering social and emotional competence, I think, again, that's why I'm here, is to have conversations about relational concepts that sometimes we don't really talk about, and how to promote healthy caregiver-child relationships. Now, when I change the language, just to be strong and flexible, like today, we're very flexible, to be able to know what our caregivers need. I'm realizing something, a little typo I used to say parents' needs on here, but we don't have necessarily all parents who are caring for our children. And so when I was updating this presentation, like you were even saying, you have a grandchild who's on the spectrum. And so your thinking is already in the mindset of, we are one of our grandchildren's caregivers. And so I wanted to be mindful of that, because we live in Florida, of course, where we have a high retirement community. But I can tell you in my practice, in my daily life, I probably speak to a grandparent on a daily basis when it comes to caring either for their grandchildren or adopted children or neighborhood children. But grandparents now are becoming much more engaged and involved in caregiver roles. And so I wanted to give credence to that and acknowledge how important grandparents are. Being a great caregiver is part natural and part learned. We didn't necessarily grow up just thinking all these things and coming automatically to us. We've learned and taken in a lot of information. We all need help sometimes. Caregivers need to help their children communicate and give your children the love and respect they need. So I put those words out there, and I guess you could say my charge to any ministry, not just this church, is how often are we seeing these words in your literature? How often are we seeing this language and the various things that are open to the community and are discussed when it comes to how much we care for each other and how much we want to let others know that we notice them, that we love them, that we care for them. So it's a nice framework to think about, because there's a lot of science behind it, first of all. But secondly, I think it is a nice way to pivot and to think about how modern times, and it goes back to the Reformation, right? We're all reformed in our faith. We're always revealed what it is about the world that we can learn more about. And so when it comes to, I think, the revelation of the science, and I'm a faith medical model being creature. I'm always integrating faith and science. I went to seminary. I live in a world that I know I can't always necessarily share my faith, but I show my faith. And so when it comes to how I live out my faith and how I understand the science, I think that the protective factors is a nice framework to consider. Any comments or questions about the framework? No?
Number 5 says caregivers need to help their children communicate. To me, that's the biggest one up there.
Yes.
For us.
Yes. We assume that children communicate easily or quickly, but what we now know is they have technology that does it for them. All they have to do is type a few words, and they think that communicates, and no words actually are spoken. I know many families who will text their children to come to the table for dinner, right? But when it comes to being able to socially, emotionally engage with each other, I think we're losing those skills. How we make eye contact, how we express ourselves, how we advocate for ourselves and be present. And I mean, part of why I feel so passionately about this, and I'm so glad that you welcomed me here today, is because We have to let people understand the relevance of being able to emotionally and socially connect with each other. And these devices are wonderful, don't get me wrong. I need my device. I'm not here to criticize it in that way. But I also know that I can't lose my voice in the process of needing that. And some replace it, one for the other. And so our children are losing that skill set of what it's like to order for themselves at a meal. Now you go up to a kiosk and you type in a few things at Panera's and there's your order. You don't have to necessarily say anything. You pay at the kiosk, you hit a few buttons, and you don't have any contact. It's at the little countertop there, and you get your food and you leave. Not once did you have to say please or thank you or what I want or what I need or may I have a glass of water. It's all right there, done for you. And because of that, our children are assuming they don't necessarily have to speak up. And it's very dangerous, because then when we're angry, when we're sad, when we're hurting, we don't know how to handle that. We don't know what to say. We don't know how to mitigate the impact emotionally on ourselves. So great comment on that. I'll just go through these quickly because on some level I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. But as I mentioned, the caregiver resilience, it is essential and it helps eliminate stress from caregiving to some level, but it's not gonna completely eliminate it because it's just a given. Stress is inevitable. Caregiver resilience affirms the ability to constructively cope with and bounce back from all types of challenges, and the ability to creatively solve problems, building trusting relationships, maintain a positive attitude, and can seek help when needed. And I think that last bullet point, I would think the church wants to be that. Unfortunately nowadays, what I assume a lot of people do is if they're looking for something, they go to the internet, they go to the World Wide Web, and they type in Google, a keyword or whatever, but instead they don't necessarily pick up a phone and call a friend. But I can tell you, because we don't necessarily pick up the phone and call a friend, we are losing that creative solving of problems because we do it on our own. And that's the danger. When we solve problems independent of anyone else engaging us, then we are limiting ourselves when it comes to the expansion of possibilities. Because your brain is necessary, your brain is necessary, my brain is necessary. And that community impact helps make me better. It helps make that person better. And the internet world is not going to necessarily take care of my feelings. It may give me a direction to go when I need to solve a problem, like I need a new vet because our vet retired. But I'm worried about my elderly dog. So the internet's not going to help me when it comes to the concern about my aging animal. But someone else can help me with that pain or struggle. Social connections, I could preach about this all day long. We are made for connection, we're born for connection, we are made from relationship, and we are comprised of relationships. I'm not just Lisa, I am Lisa and Fernando, my husband. I am Lisa and AJ, my son, or Lisa and Debbie, my daughter. I am Lisa and Jean, my mother. So those relationships affect me, and I cannot say that I am outside of the capacity of what those relationships do for me, provide for me, give me, have given me. And so when we think about where our connections have purpose, that it all helps in understanding that I am here because of a huge community of people who loved on me. There's no way that I would be here without that. And those connections are essential. But also we can do that for caregivers. And the church is a caregiver. The church is intended to be caring for the flock. It is intended to be the place where people go when they need others. So going back to other ways we can connect, though, is maybe thinking a little bit more creatively about what are some needs that we can meet the community? What are some things that we can do to meet these families? Because I guarantee you most of them may not necessarily ask, but when they see it, they'll notice it and they'll be like, that sounds really cool. Isolation. So I do talk about, just from a mental health perspective, 2 things that get most people in trouble are boredom and loneliness. When we fall into a trap, when we get ourselves in a rut, or we end up making an unhealthy decision or a destructive, toxic decision, it's typically because of isolation, which that isolation can lead to boredom and loneliness.
That's where the technology and the computers and the phones sort of say, yeah, we're not isolated, but they really are.
They really are. They're engaging a screen, which may feel real.
But that's my point. They come away thinking they're having these positive friendships and my best friends on the phone. I've never met them. I don't even
Right.
know their name, but they're there.
Right. And they're assuming what's on the other end of that screen or the
Real.
other side is real and is who they say they are. But now we're coming to know that most of the time it's not. I mean, do I really want the world to know that I'm 5'1"? I'm not going to tell them all that necessarily, right? They're going to see it when they know me. But when I post things on the media, I'm probably going to post my more positive traits. I'm going to exaggerate a little bit, or I'm just going to add a couple things that maybe someone else would say that's true about me. But I can make myself any way, shape, or form I want to be online. I can create my avatar, basically. Right? And so because of that, there's the danger. We can feel like we're connecting with people, but instead what we're really doing is creating false senses of who we are and false communication. And then we're creating within ourselves the perceptions that people only want a certain side of us. They only want to see this part of me. They don't necessarily want to see this part of me, my 5'1" self. They may want to see the 5'5" person, right? So when it comes to thinking about how isolation can lead to boredom and loneliness, I think it just goes back to understanding that we can easily, once we start to experience, understand the value and importance of connecting with people, but being able to invite people into the presence and be real in real time with someone can help in mitigating some of these issues or struggles with times of stress. Plus, it's a nice way to connect, and you don't have to say a lot. You really don't. You just have to be there for people. Knowledge of caregiving and child development. I am curious, and there is a preschool here, I believe, right?
Yeah, a big one.
A big one. How many children are in it? Do you know?
I don't know, but it's 100 or more.
Wow.
It's large, yeah.
Wow, that's wonderful. When I came up
They take the whole bottom floor here,
of this building,
the whole bottom floor.
yeah, I saw the playground when you walk in, so I saw that. The reason I was asking, we know that children who are in preschool settings are more susceptible to being expelled and suspended from childcare facilities than high schoolers. So we actually see a higher rate of suspensions and expulsions from childcare than we do from high schools. But the other side that I wanted to ask about that is also we know that only a third of children who have some type of developmental struggle will actually be noticed until they get to a more formalized educational system. Now that's kind of surprising because most people who work in child care facilities have a child care certificate and they have training when it comes to understanding children. They have training when it comes to understanding discipline and behavior management. But I think what happens is, and that's where I thought just being mindful again of these protective factors, is there are little nuances, there's little subtle signs along the way where we start to suspect like there may be something going on with the child. So I was curious, like when your grandson may have been diagnosed, do you mind sharing how old
Yeah,
he was?
16.
16. So here he was, probably in how many various settings
A lot.
where he had someone like me maybe, or a teacher, or someone who was supposed to have known, but he was missed. He was missed. And that 16 years, on some level, what we would say is the earlier we get involved, the better the outcome. The better the results, the earlier we intervene. That's where I'm an infant mental health specialist, or my PhD work is in infant and early childhood development. But it's a growing field because I believe in, well, a little bit of my background is I actually started working in protective services. So I worked as a child protective investigator with Arnold Palmer Hospital. And I was a part of that unit. And I started to hear, though, even though I had been there for 6 years before I went off to grad school, but my supervisor had been there longer, and she's like, I just saw this mom 10 years ago. The mom of now the baby that now was in our setting. And so we know that there's a cyclical nature to parenting, and there's a cyclical nature to abuse. And there's also a cyclical nature to neglect. And so that inspired me to go, well, what are we missing out on? How are we failing these families? And I think it is because we just aren't paying attention to each other the way that we could. And so the more opportunities that we can provide families that's accurate information about development, that's relevant information like about neurodiversity and autism and all of those things, and remove the stigma from that, I think we'll see better
I think that's
outcomes.
a big issue.
The stigma, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with your brain working different. Nothing wrong at all. There's nothing wrong if you walk with a limp, or you may have a lisp, or you may have an eye that twitches. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But again, that's where I think that the body here, the church can receive people and love them and how they were made and designed. Any other comments, questions about this? Okay. Concrete support. I know we talked about this. I think that the church does this really, really well. So I'm preaching to the choir when it comes to that. But it is part of the protective factors. And then I spent a lot of time last week about the social emotional needs of children. But I think, and I'm not here because I know Victoria is a teacher, and I'm not here to discount at all the value of formal education. But I do think that social emotional education needs to be prioritized, and we need to value it just as much as we do math and science.
Well, he's now in a school that is their priority.
Mm-hmm. Right, because we can take all that knowledge, but if we don't know how to apply it and how to interact with people and how to share and communicate it, it's just stuck. It's not going to go anywhere. So going back to, we have to be able to sit in front of a crowd, in front of a couple people, and be able to express ourselves. We need to be able to manage the pressure that comes from being asked questions or being able to say what you need and express yourself. So learning how to handle these kind of experiences and environments.
But it's teaching the parent and the teacher how to recognize this, because you just think the kid's screwed up. You don't know why, but you just think that way. And as you said, it's not that they're screwed up, they just think differently.
They think differently. I have a case right now. So many of my cases that I work with, so I'm both a clinical director of our counseling center, and then I do have my own clients that I see, because I can't imagine not doing both. It keeps me relevant. But when it comes to certain family law cases, what I'm often noticing, especially in high conflict situations, and I'm sure we're all impacted by families who break apart and just don't know how to co-parent or how to get along post-divorce. So that's what I do. I try to help with co-parenting, creating these social emotional networks and communities and connections between parents, and acknowledging they may no longer be partners or married partners, but now they still are parents to these children, and how essential that both of them are involved in their children's lives, and how them getting along is imperative to their child's mental and physical wellness. So one thing that I've noticed in a particular case that I just got involved in is the mother is accusing the father of mistreating the child. And the child is soon to be 5 in December. And the father is denying the allegations, and actually everyone involved does not see evidence that this child was mistreated, but that's the mom's place. And I was asked to get involved to see what the relationship is between the child and father, if in fact he had mistreated, because there's a lot of social and emotional cues that we notice in the way we engage each other that can tell us if that child fears her father, if she is not wanting to be near him, if she doesn't want to engage him. So there's things that I'm trained in that I look for and that I put into a report. But also my noticing of this child, she has some delays. She doesn't like to speak. She always actually tells me to stop talking. She has some words that are not pronounced very clearly, and she doesn't necessarily know how to hold utensils and draw, and she's 4.5 in VPK. And so I'm getting involved, and there's other therapists who are involved, and I'm getting a look, right? I'm like, this child has delays, and I think that's why she acts out in daycare every day. She throws chairs, she hits her teachers, she hits other kids, and so I get involved, and I'm like, I don't necessarily believe that these child acting out behaviors are because of her being mistreated. I actually suspect that she has some developmental delays. Now, the mom is kind of resisting a little bit, like, what? She's fine. She can write her name. She talks to people she trusts. And I'm like, well, let's just see. But I'm trained in knowing. And then I'm also needing to recognize that most children do not act out unless there's a reason. And so I don't want to assume this child's dysregulation is because of maltreatment. I have to look at all possible reasons for her dysregulation, but I can tell you, most kids who act out in childcare settings, it's because they haven't eaten, they haven't slept, or they have a developmental delay. It's not necessarily because that they have someone at home mistreating them. So I'm all about sleeping and eating. It's so imperative with growing kids because most of the time they don't eat enough and they don't sleep enough. So, all right, any other comments about this slide?
With sleeping and eating, wouldn't that be a form of, not abuse, but be a form of just not paying attention or not?
It
they
could.
Care, but they're not really caring.
It goes back to concrete support. So like say you have a single parent who only gets home at 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and they are the one income
Right. Well,
for the family,
I'm not
right?
talking about that. I'm talking about
Right.
you have a parent or parents, and they really don't get the kids to bed at night.
Or they may not, yeah.
Or they don't really have a set time for dinner.
Right, they may not understand the structure. Yeah.
So I'm saying, is that what do you call that?
Well, it can go back to making sure that parents have accurate information. Because I can tell you that I have a 12 and a 14-year-old, and so I've experienced what it's like to go to a pediatric appointment, and I don't know if you kind of remember those days, and maybe you're involved in your grandchildren's pediatric appointments, but most of the time when you go, they don't talk to you about sleeping and eating. They may ask you, are they a picky eater? Are they eating okay? Have they lost or gained weight? But they don't have but 15 minutes to educate you on the things that what they believe insurance is dictating to them, which is most of the time like immunizations or more critical health issues. It's not necessarily talking about sleeping and eating. They may note it, but it takes you, the parent, to advocate. But most parents, if the doctor didn't say anything, and that goes back to the case I just mentioned, there were some early signs from the medical providers. This child was failing her hearing screenings, and they said, don't worry about it. And I'm like, what? That doesn't make sense. If you fail your hearing screening more than once, but twice or 3 times, that's significant. You don't ignore that. You don't ignore that. But the medical community didn't think it was that relevant at the time because there were other things going on. So the parents took that information, and here we are 4.5 years later with a child who I now believe has some type of communication or language struggle. So, and it could be related to how she's hearing or not hearing. We just don't know yet.
And teachers will pick up on the sleeping and the eating a lot, especially the sleeping when the kids fall asleep in school all the time.
Yep, and I know the schools are offering free meals.
Yeah.
They offer free
Yeah.
breakfast now, and they don't, if a child goes through the line and doesn't have money, they will feed that child.
Yes.
So, and I know many people, like churches included, who will kind of raise funds to help pay off balances that the schools may have because of unpaid, lunch fees or whatever. So I know that, and we always hear those messages, like when it's testing time, make sure your child is eaten that morning and well rested. But other than that, I think that we're just really busy people, and sometimes we just assume that when people are tired they're going to go to bed, and we don't always educate necessarily like what's a good window of time for your child to be sleeping. You can get this information online, but it doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily seek it or find it easily.
To attack, a lot of kids take their phones and stuff to bed, and you think they're in bed and they're online.
Yeah, we've had to, my one son who he reminds me of like, he's got an old soul, and I used to trust him with his devices in his room, but now we're taking him out because he's getting a little ornery, and I think it has a lot to do with his tech connection, so. Yeah, say that again.
We see a lot of that.
Yeah. So, and they grow and evolve, right? He's got a girlfriend now, and he's becoming more connected socially, and he seeks those relationships out, so of course he's gonna wanna talk to his friends. I don't blame him for that, but it is my job, mine and his father's job, to kind of help him rein it in. How can we build healthy relationships with children? Now, this was interesting because last week when it came up, there was some, what I would say, a little bit of apprehension and concern about, do we just talk to a child on campus and not fear what the repercussions of that or what someone may think we're trying to do, and have it be maybe what I would say like under false pretenses. But I still believe that there's ways that we can listen more than talk to our children. There's still ways that we can connect with children on campus and not necessarily know who they are. We can find ways to help build relationships with children in an indirect way that can communicate these things, which is understanding that children matter, their emotions matter. We are here to model for you how to handle our emotions, and we can preserve our dignity in the process. So I think one struggle, and you may have heard various things in media, like when a child is acting out and law enforcement is called, sometimes law enforcement is just going to do whatever they may do with an adult, instead of understanding that this may be differently and how to manage a child, or someone with mental illness may be handled or apprehended in a way that isn't necessarily preserving their dignity because there may be a fear of what we would say their potential dangerousness is. And so being mindful that whenever we're around someone who's struggling, it's always important to do that with preserving their dignity and being respectful. And so when a children's acting out on the playground or children's melting down in the middle of worship, how do we handle that though in a way that doesn't shame the parents so they'll come back next week instead of feeling embarrassed? Or I think sometimes too, and this may be a sensitive subject, but say we have a nursing parent and maybe, they may be nursing in a certain area because there's no other place for them to go. So how do we still manage and help welcome children into our community, onto the campus, and think about these things that our parents experience? Is there a particular place that women can go to nurse? Do we know if there's a place where they can nurse in privacy?
You're talking about here?
Yes.
Oh, there's all kinds of rooms. They just pick up and go.
But I don't know if that's maybe communicated though. Like say you have a visiting family and I don't know. Just a thought.
In the nursery, there.
In the nursery.
We have nursery and we have children's church, so they would have a place down there.
Yeah. And I just put it out there because some churches don't. Some churches don't have a place. Some businesses don't have a place. Like if the mother's pumping or the mother needs to be able to go somewhere privately, schools are terrible for that, believe it or not. Like,
They've gotten better.
Have they? Yeah. So all those little subtle things though that communicate to people that we notice them, that their needs matter, and we're putting ourselves in their shoes, and we can understand the world and the struggles they have to live with, and we're here to help mitigate the stress because of being a working mama or a working family and all that. That's good to hear. Okay. So being reflective, and we're going to get into that a little bit, just being mindful of our own actions. If I were having a tough day, if I were, dissatisfied about something or just not happy, you would feel that energy. And so making sure that I'm always checking myself and being mindful of my actions, and that I am asking myself questions, especially when it comes to when I've messed up. When I've maybe had a failure or made a mistake. Am I thinking about the circumstance of that situation and thinking about how I can learn from it, and also be better? But the church, I think, can do that as well. Like today, we didn't maybe get the attendance that we were hoping for. So what is it that we can reflect upon to think about improving attendance on this subject matter and ways to get people to attend? Thinking about how we ask empowering questions, open-ended questions that may encourage children to find their answers instead of doing it for them. And I go back to energy, and that energy attracts energy. Like it's just how it is. We're not going to necessarily say something about it, but we usually feel it. Like there's probably someone in your family that you may not connect with because of their energy. And it's just how it is. We do feel what each other feels, and we do experience that energy, even though we may not say anything about it.
Kids pick up on that, and when you're the teacher, if you're having a bad day, then your class tends to have a bad day, just because they're picking up on it.
They sure do. They sure do. It's only 30% of our communication is verbal. The other 70 is nonverbal. And so what is it about our nonverbal communication that we feel from each other and we notice? And the church is no different, right? There's an energy here on campus. There's an energy within the body and the people here. And so how does that convey the messages that you want to be heard when someone comes here for the first time? Like I will say, it was such a wonderful blessing to have, is it Katrina? Or the woman in the coffee shop? Astrid. So she was so sweet. She waved, she welcomed me in, she was asking what I wanted for tea. I mean, everything about, and she didn't have to say a whole lot. It was also her body language, her smile, her way that she conveyed welcome to me that made me feel really good. And that was lovely to see. And I'm assuming she does that with everybody who probably walks in that shop. But that's really critical. That is a huge blessing and a positive jewel that I think your campus and church has.
She's the church secretary.
Is she? That's wonderful. So she probably gets this too. Too bad she can't be up here with us. Maybe she'll get to watch it. You go get her. Yeah, but there's probably a lot that she can relate to this and maybe expand upon. Mm-hmm. So what is mindfulness? And I'm going to go into some more concrete, and if you can help me with time, Victoria, that would be great. Because I have more slides than probably I have time, but I'm always one of those people that would rather have too much to talk about than not enough. But thinking about what mindfulness is, that is another buzzword going back to resilience, but it is a type of meditation. It is a way to self-reflect. It is focusing on what are we feeling and what are we sensing in the moment. So our senses, like we're picking up on the lighting in the room, the volume of my voice, what we're seeing. I always like to use a visual when I'm speaking or teaching, because trying to help people through multiple ways through our senses, we know that the learning becomes more impactful. And so thinking about who we are and how we're experiencing our world is really critical. So I think I shared a little bit about my daughter last week. She is adopted and she is on the spectrum herself, and she's had a lot of trauma. And both of her parents, her biological parents, are deceased. So she's experienced a lot for a little 12-year-old person. But she's also very sensory off. What she thinks she's hearing is not necessarily what she's hearing. What she thinks she's seeing isn't necessarily what she's seeing. So we are constantly trying for her to be more, especially when it comes to her, like her body signals. She forgets to go to the bathroom, or she doesn't realize she's hungry, or she doesn't know where her anger is coming from. So just her learning how to pay attention to her body, what her body signals are, what is going on, where am I feeling pain, how am I hearing this person or not hearing this person. It's a life skill that's going to hopefully help her be safe throughout her lifespan. But we know that we don't practice this enough. We just don't. So it's a nice way to help people through appreciating their bodies, understanding how their body works, and plus it's a great way to calm down. So I think even teaching this in the preschool settings and the Sunday school settings, you can do this with scripture, you can do this with a gospel song, you can do it with any form of integrated faith where you can think about the lyrics or the words, you can think about the melodies, you can think about a Bible verse or scripture, and then think about how your body's responding to that and what it does to you from a sensory perspective.
I was teaching that to my creative and to my gifted kids.
Nice.
Because they definitely have a lot of that stress from parents and teachers and them themselves to be perfect all the time. So we worked a lot on that.
On mindfulness, nice. And there is science behind it telling us that it does reduce stress. And just some benefits from the science, we know that it can decrease depression, stress and anxiety, it can increase levels of life satisfaction, and it can increase self-esteem, that self-awareness, and the emotional control or the regulation. So neurodiverse people, not just children, but anyone who may deal with neurodiversity, mindfulness is very critical because they may not always be able to articulate what they're experiencing, they just know there's something going on. So being able to pause, teach them a way to focus inward instead of outward, and try to examine themselves as to what may be going on is really, really important. Some techniques, I list them here quickly, and again, I'm happy to share this PowerPoint because there are a few links here, and I'm not going to necessarily go through all the links, but there's a whole packet that you can pull up through positivepsychology.com, and I'm a big fan of positive psychology. I'll go into this just a little bit. Eastern medicine, Western medicine, I may have even talked about this last week. Like in Eastern medicine, we deal with the symptoms and we target that. Like I have a cough, so I'm given a cough syrup. Or I have a headache, so I take some form of over-the-counter medication. But in Western medicine belief, what they'll say is, yes, you have a headache, but before I necessarily treat that, have you had enough water? Could it be dehydration? Could it be that you're not having electrolytes? So we try to look at the root cause of things. So positive psychology actually comes from that mindset where not every symptom is necessarily an indication that we have to treat, where we can build upon strengths or we can look at deeper issues. So from a positive perspective, like there's so many positives around us, and if we build upon those positives, what some will say is that our weaknesses will actually improve. When we focus on the good things, our weaknesses will actually not be so weak. And not that I'm a big radio listener, because I do like to limit what I'm always hearing in the car, but there was a segment that I heard on the radio where some recent research, and I can't quote who it was, said something about the key to happiness at one time used to be what we believed was like a bigger bank account or more things or more money. But now what we think it is really gratitude. Gratitude is what we believe is a secret to happiness. And so from a positive psychology perspective, we think that like exercises in gratitude, which you'll find in the manual there, doing a body scan, a seated meditation, or just even a 3-minute breathing exercise or 3-minute breathing space. And we find it on our Fitbits or I think the iWatches have them now where you can follow the little app on your phone or on your watch, and you can notice like a circle expand in or out. So there's various things that now are teaching us how to breathe. And then some informal meditation is thinking about the here and now, being aware of what we're doing, just the body awareness that I talked about. And then asking yourself when you are impulsive or you're being reactive, where is that coming from? Like what's going on that caused you to feel or react the way you were? And how do we maybe interact with others? So those are some nice mindfulness techniques. How are we doing on time?
It's 20 to
20 till. So I have until what time?
20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. So I guess to make this a little more interactive, I am curious, before talking about mindfulness today or some of the meditation things, I'm curious, do you mind sharing if you've had some personal experiences with that? I know you shared with your classroom, but maybe, or anything at the church that we've ever noticed or experienced, or do you think that that may be an opportunity?
I'm not sure of the question.
If you've ever personally practiced a mindfulness exercise or a breathing exercise, or if you've ever seen the church utilize.
We've had so many courses in this church.
Have you? Okay.
That some of the courses have included some of that.
Okay.
It's not a centerfold theme.
Okay, so it's kind of been incorporated
I don't think
into.
you.
No. Okay.
But it has occurred in different, and we have different prayer groups. We have a lot of different prayer groups.
Nice.
And the one I'm in on Monday mornings does a lot of that because the lady who leads it really believes in that.
That's awesome. That's great. Because some will say that when people are busy, they may not necessarily build it into their schedule like we would build our lunch hour into our schedule or build an errand into our schedule.
Well, I think almost every class I've ever been in here encourages people to get time alone. That's part of what you're talking about.
Yes.
Or if we big on reading a chapter of the Bible a day.
Or if we build it into what's already a life of their schedule, such as coming to church or going to a class, then that helps.
But that's a once a week thing for most people.
Well, and it's just like any habit or practice, is it does take some time to experience it before you may take the time to apply
What
it.
you just said, William is encouraging people daily to read a chapter, and there are other people that are encouraging people to just take a minute, just take 5 minutes, whatever it is, just take it and just get alone.
Right. Breathe and focus on what's going on within you and where you may feel within how you're managing your world and your life. So that's wonderful. That's great. So family reflection, I like to think about, again, incorporating the mindfulness strategies, but doing within the context of relationships, that you can actually do a mindfulness exercise as a family and reflect. I think at one time we probably called them like family meetings or powwows or let's just get together and talk. But in a family reflection practice, it's very intentional with trying to cover these topics, such as what's going on with our emotions and feelings, and how is it that we can encourage and have conversation that's meaningful. I don't know if you've ever thought about those things, ever talked about those things, have some personal experiences, but I can tell you, having 2 middle schoolers and having meaningful conversation is very, very important for me, because there are things that they are seeing and experiencing on a daily basis that they wouldn't necessarily tell me, but because they know that I care and I inquire and I ask, that I don't necessarily fear that they're going to use a harsh word or a word that we typically don't say because they want to repeat what they heard at school today. Or I'm not going to necessarily shame them for making a poor choice or doing something that they knew they weren't supposed to because someone solicited from them, like, hey, come to the bathroom with me and let's be late to class. So having meaningful conversation with them and understanding that there's nothing here that you can tell me that I'm going to judge, that I validate your feelings, that I understand being a middle schooler is tough, and that I want to be that person, that place where you can know that you can come for support, even when life is hard. So using the mindfulness exercises, being able to incorporate that into family discussions is extremely important, and not to be afraid of tough conversation, that we have to be and living in a place of honesty and truth, and that even in their dark places that they don't necessarily have to hide that from the parents or their caregivers, because if they start doing that, then I'm not doing my job. Not doing my job. Any comments or questions? Come on. So how to lead a reflection time. I just put these helpful hints, like I had already shared a few rules that I have set in ours. The best times usually are in the car, but any type of one-on-one time, asking open-ended questions, writing some things down, and asking about feelings and making sure that I'm not doing all the talking like I feel like I'm doing right now. But it's all good, right? That I'm listening, if anything, more than I'm talking with my children. So how do we recognize stress in young children? And so this goes back to when I said how many expulsions and suspensions that we're seeing in childcare facilities. So children who are having a hard time sleeping, children who are very fussy, children that have separation anxiety, that may be hitting, having tantrums, changes in mood, behavior, appetite. They're not maybe able to focus as well. They may lose interest in their work, and there may be some struggles with their appearance and their hygiene, and we may see them engage in risky or reckless behaviors. And then even young kids talk about death and suicide, which a lot of people are surprised by this, but
I'm not surprised.
you're not.
Not at all.
Not at all.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because there's some people who want to be in denial about that. Now, do they necessarily understand what they're saying sometimes? Probably not. Like, I don't know if they necessarily understand the gravity of the situation and they may be repeating it, but for them, they may think that they can't handle the stress of a friend who's now abandoning them. Or they may think they can't handle the pressures of going into a new classroom or a new teacher or a mean person in their room. So helping children understand that anxiety is a part of life, stress unfortunately is inevitable, but as we think about where life takes us, that doesn't mean you're doing it alone, and we're here to support you, and you can talk about these things. But I think part of why I'm here, and going back to why I feel so passionately about this subject matter, is sometimes parents don't necessarily think that could be a stress related.
I think the biggest issue, in my opinion, purely my opinion, is trust.
Explain more. What do you mean?
Well, because we didn't raise this child as a smaller child, and yet there were different people around him, I won't go into that, who did things that would make you not want to trust people. And so he doesn't.
So you mean the children don't necessarily trust the caregivers or adults?
Correct.
And that's why then we see some of these acting out behaviors, because of the stress.
That's a big part of it. Or it's part of the when you were talking about conversations, why won't they talk to you? They don't trust you.
Yeah.
They don't trust people.
And so that validation of feelings is really important. Like I have my own formed opinions, right? But they're mine. So if someone's expressing theirs,
But
who am
you're
I?
right?
Right, I know, right? That's what it goes back to. So as the parent, we have to be right. And so we can disagree with someone, but to take away their feelings or opinions is not then going to be very
What I'm
relationship
getting at
building, right?
is how do you get over, they've already got the trust problem, and how you get over that problem is really, really, really hard.
Well, and being there, showing up, being consistent, listening more than talking, asking for feelings, asking for meaningful conversation. I mean, those are all those social emotional skills that I think some people discredit or don't realize the importance of. But showing up to that game when you say you're going to be there, being at the pickup line when you're going to make sure they don't get wet. You know, all those little signs of being able to build trust from a nonverbal perspective, not necessarily our words, because that's where the words fall short probably for that child. Like they said they were going to be there, but they didn't. So how do we just be there and be active and mindful of how our energy affects? But you bring up a good point, because I do think that we are lacking trust in people, and we also don't necessarily know how to forgive. And so teaching forgiveness.
That's not just at the child level either.
Say that again?
That's not just at the child level.
Right, adults don't either. Yeah, we're just not good at forgiveness necessarily. Now, I love forgiveness. I love talking about forgiveness. I love practicing forgiveness, and I love talking
And by
about
the way, you women seem to be able to do it a lot better than men.
than men.
Because it's like my wife can meet with a group of women, and after about 4 weeks, they're talking about stuff that takes men 5 years to start talking about. I'm actually
Right. No, I
serious.
understand that. Yeah. No, I think there is something about.
And we have a men's group on Saturday mornings that meets, and we've been meeting for 20 years. A lot of the guys have been meeting only for about 10, but it's still a long time. It's really been the last 3 or 4 years that the guys have been consistent, and they're beginning to open up. But it takes men forever because they don't trust. At least that's my opinion.
Right. I mean, I can see that. And I also think, I mean, even though some may say, you know, we're evolving in our understanding of gender types, but I do think that there's this image of what strength is for men versus women, and I think sometimes that's communicated or taught in a different way, right?
Yeah.
About what strength means, yeah.
Boys can't cry.
Not supposed
And
to
you
have
can't be
feelings,
wrong.
right?
You can't be ever wrong. That gets in a lot of arguments.
Yeah, right. And, you know, and it prohibits relationship, unfortunately,
Yeah.
right?
Or
Right.
limits it, yeah.
Right. And so how do we acknowledge that there are things that we've done, and again, in reflection, how do we learn from that? How do we allow ourselves to change or to pivot, knowing that that technique or strategy or idea isn't necessarily helping us, right? It's non-relational, we know that. But also I can admire that level of strength, right? I can admire when a hurricane's coming, my husband's gonna be up putting boards on the windows, you know? He's gonna be the one that's gonna make sure the generator works and that everything has the cords, right? Because there's a certain element to him that does know this is what he does in terms of strength for his family. But on the flip side, I'm sure he's beat tired and he's probably upset or emotional and wishing that he could just sleep too, right? But he's not going to necessarily tell me, but I know to ask. So, but those are the qualities within relationships that are important to recognize. So, okay. Emotional coaching. We're hearing a lot of people who may be using coaches like emotional coaches instead of therapists, which isn't a bad thing at all, because there's a lot that I can help be a coach, and I don't necessarily have to be a therapist. But when I am bringing up emotional coaching for today is that we can help people with their emotions and aren't necessarily clinically trained. You can help people with their emotions and not be the clinician or the therapist like I am. Last week, I showed the Edtronic video, which was a still face experiment, and that's why I'm highlighting it again today, is that when caregivers fail to engage emotionally with their children, it is essentially like a still face to that child, and that child feels that lack of what I'll say mutual engagement. And that mutual engagement can be distressing for the child. Like, don't you see me? Don't I matter to you? Like, why aren't you looking at me? Or you're looking at me, but you're not really engaging me. And we know what engagement feels like. We know what it looks like. So when caregivers ignore children's expressions, we know that that child will be distressed. So being able to coach people of how to recognize when children bid for attention, when a child may just come up and bring you a flower, they don't have to say anything. They may just pick a flower and bring it to you, right? I'm wondering how many flowers were you maybe given sometimes when you're a teacher, right? And that was probably a word of what? I appreciate you. I'm so thankful you're my teacher. I like you. I love you. Like whatever that flower may mean, but that's a bid from a child. So understanding how important it is to receive that bid, to recognize it, to acknowledge it, and that you can now, by responding to that in a socially, emotionally healthy way, you are modeling for that child. It's okay to show someone how you feel about them. It's okay to express your feelings and emotions. And children really can learn how to master their emotions very, very well, and this will lead them into a successful life. This can carry them through their lifespan if they can, at a younger age, have social connectedness and know that when they do reach out and they bid someone to engage, that it's safe and appropriate and we can do that. And when it's not safe and appropriate to do that, like we learn how to engage each other based on at least having that opportunity with them. So here's some 5 steps to being an emotional coach. Be aware of their emotions, recognize a child's expression of emotion as an opportunity to teach and have intimacy with them so we know them, listen with empathy and validate their feelings, help children learn to label emotions with words and set limits when helping a child solve problems or deal with upsetting situations appropriately. So all of that can happen from anybody on this planet, really. It's just a matter of being willing to or having the desire to do it. But I think we can change the world if all of us had a little bit more emotional coaching strengths within us. Any comments? I saw you take a picture, Victoria, but yeah, it's really not that hard, unfortunately. So there's a resiliency toolkit. The link is here. And again, this is public information, and so I share it if you want to learn more about how to bring some resources to this church and how it can maybe be applied in the various settings. There's some links here. And just some names of it, which is Resiliency Toolkit, and some verbiage about claiming my calm, find my safe zone, name my feelings, build connections, know my state, and share my smile. That all goes back to some ways to emotionally coach our children and integrate the words they're learning and the things that they're being taught with some social and emotional skills. Okay, so I'm gonna get ready to wrap up after self-care. I bring this up because I don't know if people realize self-care is what they aren't or are doing at times. So I bring up the idea of how to even teach self-care to kids, because there's probably an assumption that going to the doctor is taking care of yourself, or making sure that we have enough to drink or we are eating is self-care. But where we are expanding is that it is often self-care is being more introspective. Like if I am upset with someone, taking care of that upset emotion is self-care. If I am unhappy about something and I want to be able to work it out with someone, taking care of that upset situation is a practice of self-care. So I think for a long time, we would sometimes deny that. Oh, I don't want to say anything. I don't want the fallout, or I don't think they're going to hear it. But we, unfortunately, then teach ourselves to be stuffers. And eventually, the more we stuff the various introspective matters that are going on within us, it is eventually going to find its way out. And that's where unresolved anger, issues about how we relate to each other or how we feel about ourselves, our self-esteem, and how we treat other people, or trust, like it eventually finds its way into some type of unhealthy path. I like to bring up Advent Health because they have a beautiful department where they also integrate medicine and science. And there is a psychologist there, Dr. Dick Tibbetts, and he did his research here at Princeton. He wrote at the Princeton campus, that's that downtown campus. And he partnered with a cardiologist, and what they did is they brought in the patient and they did a health screening, and they noticed that you could be, have a low BMI, you could be a non-smoker, you could be a healthy eater, but your cardiac profile was off the charts as if you weren't a healthy eater and you were a smoker and you had maybe an unhealthy lifestyle. And so what they started to do is they examined resentments and anger. And so the psychologist came in, and what that cardiologist did was basically did a prescription for therapy. And the book that Dr. Tibbetts wrote is Forgive to Live. And so what the premise is behind cardiology practice now at Advent, and actually you go to the American Heart Association and you'll see stress management as one of the factors to a healthy life, to a healthy heart. And so this goes back to self-care. Being able to pay attention to how your life experiences have affected you in the long run is self-care. You are increasing your health span by exponential years. You are taking care of yourself, both your feelings and your physical wellness. The two are integrated. You cannot separate the two. And so Dr. Tibbetts' work is great. It's excellent. I would recommend everybody read the book. But what they did is pre and post measurement when they sent everybody to therapy. And thankfully, their cardiac profiles looked better after they went to therapy, and they worked out whatever issues they were holding on to. So why don't we teach our children this at a younger age, right? Why can't we teach them how to take care of their mental, emotional, and physical health, and all of this is their overall well-being? So how do we even start that here with the preschool or within the nursery or within the various Sunday school rooms, that we can help them understand the benefits of self-care, and that being able to identify their emotional and physical needs also helps them be better at taking care of others' emotional and physical needs. That we can teach that this is critical to them and foundational, and that as they become older, these will be integrated practices that will come very easy for them. It allows children to develop healthy habits. Children can learn to become more independent and understand how to take care of themselves, which I think I see a lot of. I tease my nephew's about to go off to college, and so I tease him like, are you really gonna do all right when mom's not there to do your laundry? Or when she's not there to make you food? And my sister loves to cook for my nephew all the time. And so I'm like, you think he's gonna be able to cook on his own when he's off to college? And she's like, I think he will, but I tease him because going back to, we want him to be somewhat independent when he goes off to college, right? We don't want him to necessarily go starving or always go out and eat every time he's hungry when he's on campus. So how do we, or when he's off to college, so how do we help people take care of themselves and understand the value of not just the operational things, but also the emotional needs of self-care? And there's a nice little graphic that I like to accentuate. And so it says self-care and mental health tips for kids. Set aside time for low stress or solo activities. Find social groups that help them feel like they belong. Focus on articulating their feelings like I am angry, I am sad. Establish a self-care routine. Encourage them to focus on the moment. Cultivate interests and hobbies. Practice self-care for yourself to set the standard. So all these little handouts, which I think would be a beautiful poster that you could put in various places. All right, so I am going to conclude and wrap us up, and then if there's any further questions, of course, I'm here to talk to you about what is it that the church can do. In conclusion of everything I've shared both last week and this week, I believe that we can surround our caregivers and children with nurturing relationships, that we can create a trusting environment by cultivating the concepts, especially the protective factors that I brought earlier, or that I talked about earlier, that we can understand and respond to the social and emotional needs of the people who are here, who are part of this community and church, that we can spend quality engaging time together, and we can be reflective and seek feedback about our ministries and events and learn from it. So that's my conclusion and my presentation. There's my contact information, my handout. You can take a pen. I am not a stranger. You are part of my community as well. I appreciate you inviting me here today, and it's been a blessing and honor. Thank you.